Let me tell you something strange about people who don't accept last-minute invitations. We live in a world that celebrates spontaneity, that turns yes into a moral virtue and hesitation into social failure. Maybe you're one of them. The ones who need time, who can't pivot on command, who feel their chest tighten when someone says, "tonight," or "in an hour." And maybe no one has ever explained to you why that doesn't make you difficult. It makes you deliberate. If you want to understand what you feel without labels and find words to explain yourself without justifying, subscribe. Here we translate psychology into relief, not diagnosis. This isn't about fixing you. It's about finally seeing that what the world calls rigidity might actually be the quiet architecture of a mind that refuses to fragment itself. Because some people don't say no to the invitation. They say no to the violence of being pulled out of their own rhythm without permission. The world calls this inflexibility. It whispers that you're antisocial, that you overthink, that you can't just go with the flow. But what if it's the opposite? What if refusing last-minute invitations is a quiet form of self-respect? A way of honoring the promises you've already made to your time, your energy, your need for internal coherence? What if it's not about controlling others, but about not losing control of yourself? Because there are invisible virtues here that no one names. There's the ability to protect your mental space from constant invasion. There's the maturity to know that presence without preparation is performance, not connection. There's the clarity to understand that your time isn't a blank page waiting for others to write on it. It's already full, already spoken for, already belonging to a version of yourself that planned, that anticipated, that built a small world you can't abandon just because someone else's spontaneity demands it. Maybe what looks like resistance is actually integrity. Maybe what sounds like no is really, "I already said yes to myself." We live in a culture that rewards the opposite, where flexibility has become a currency and boundaries feel like barricades. Where "let's do something tonight" is treated as an exciting opportunity, and "I can't, I have plans" sounds like a confession of failure, even when those plans are rest, solitude, or simply the mental space you carved out to exist without obligation. But maybe the real rigidity is having to be available at all times to prove you're alive. The pressure is everywhere. Social media glorifies the last-minute adventure, the unplanned night that becomes a story, the friend group that thrives on impulse. Meanwhile, you're the one who feels your nervous system spike when your phone lights up with, "Are you free right now?" It's not that you don't want connection, it's that connection for you requires preparation, not of what you'll say or where, but of who you'll be. Because showing up isn't just physical, it's emotional, psychological, energetic. And you can't summon that on command. Psychologists call this having an internal locus of temporal control. It's the need to feel authorship over your own schedule, to experience time as something you shape rather than something that happens to you. In other words, it's knowing that your presence is valuable enough to require intention, not from others, but from yourself. It's the difference between being spontaneous and being scattered, between saying yes because you want to and saying yes because you're afraid of what no reveals about you. For people like you, last-minute invitations aren't just inconvenient, they're destabilizing. They interrupt the mental narrative you've been building, the emotional ecosystem you've been tending. You've already mapped out your evening, your weekend, your inner weather. And when someone asks you to abandon that map without warning, it's not an invitation, it's an imposition. It's being asked to choose between disappointing someone else or betraying yourself. And most of the time, the world has taught you that disappointing yourself is the safer option. But you've learned it's also the one that empties you from the inside. Of course, it doesn't always come from peace. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's the terror of being seen before you've decided how you want to be visible. Sometimes it's defense. A wall built so carefully over the years that you don't know anymore where protection ends and isolation begins. And that's okay, because even fear is a form of care. Even walls are a way of saying, I matter enough to guard. There are moments when saying no to last-minute plans is about anxiety, not autonomy. When it's less, I've already committed to myself, and more, I'm terrified of what will happen if I leave the house unprepared. When the real reason isn't self-respect but self-protection, and the line between the two becomes so thin, you can't tell which side you're on anymore. That's the vulnerable truth. Sometimes this boundary is wisdom, sometimes it's a cage, and sometimes it's both at once. But here's what the world doesn't tell you. Even when it comes from fear, it's still valid. Even when it's a defense mechanism, it's still defending something real. Your need for predictability in a chaotic world. Your need for control when so much feels uncontrollable. Your need to show up as a whole person instead of whatever fragments you can gather in 30 minutes. The origin doesn't erase the legitimacy. You're allowed to need time. You're allowed to need notice. You're allowed to structure your life in a way that doesn't fit into someone else's idea of spontaneity. And maybe what you're really protecting isn't your schedule. Maybe it's your nervous system. Maybe it's the part of you that learned, somewhere along the way, that you can't be everything to everyone at any moment, and that trying to be is how you disappear. So you hold the line, you say, I need advance notice. You risk being called rigid. And in doing so, you choose presence over performance. You choose depth over availability. You choose to be someone who arrives fully, even if it means arriving less often. Declining last-minute invitations isn't coldness, it's emotional maturity. It's not antisocial behavior, it's self-knowledge. It's not fear of life, it's respect for the life you're already living. Because every time you say yes without meaning it, you fracture a little. Every time you abandon your own plans to accommodate someone else's spontaneity, you send yourself a message. Your time doesn't matter. Your rhythm doesn't matter. Your need for coherence doesn't matter. But when you say, I can't tonight, but I'd love to plan something for next week, that's not rejection. That's integrity. You're not saying no to connection. You're saying yes to a version of connection that doesn't require you to betray your own needs. You're saying that relationships matter too much to show up half-present, resentful, drained before you even arrive. You're saying that the people you love deserve the version of you that had time to prepare, to center, to choose them fully, not the fragmented version that said yes out of guilt. There's a particular kind of peace in living this way. It's the peace of knowing that your calendar reflects your values, not your fears. That your commitments, even to yourself, are sacred, that you don't have to apologize for needing structure in a world that glorifies chaos. And when you finally find people who understand that, who text you 3 days in advance, who say, I know you need notice, so I'm asking now, who respect that your boundaries aren't walls but windows, you realize what you've been protecting all along. Not isolation, but the possibility of real intimacy. Avoiding last-minute plans isn't about being difficult. It's about being deliberate. It's about understanding that your presence is a gift that requires preparation. Not performance preparation, but the preparation of a soul deciding to step outside itself and meet another. And that decision deserves time. It deserves intention. It deserves the dignity of not being treated like an afterthought. Maybe what you're really saying when you decline that last-minute invitation isn't, I don't want to see you. It's, I want to see you when I'm actually here. A person like this once tried to be spontaneous. She said yes to every last-minute invitation, convinced that flexibility was the same as kindness, that availability proved love. She showed up to dinners she hadn't mentally prepared for, to gatherings her nervous system wasn't ready for, to moments she had no space to hold. And every time she felt herself disappearing, not into connection, but into performance. The exhaustion wasn't from being social, it was from being social while fractured. When she finally accepted her own rhythm, when she started saying, "I need a few days' notice," something unexpected happened. The friendships that stayed weren't less deep, they were more honest. The invitations that came weren't less frequent, they were more intentional. And the version of herself that showed up wasn't less present, she was finally fully there. Studies show that people with strong temporal boundaries tend to report lower anxiety and higher relationship satisfaction. But the most beautiful part isn't the data. It's when theory becomes peace, when you stop apologizing for needing what you need, because the real transformation isn't learning to accept last-minute invitations. It's learning to accept yourself, the person who can't pivot on command, who needs structure to feel safe, who understands that spontaneity without preparation isn't freedom, it's fragmentation. And maybe the people who truly see you don't ask you to change that. They plan ahead. They give you notice. They understand that your depth requires time to surface, and when you finally arrive, centered, whole, chosen, they feel the difference. They feel the presence that only comes from someone who had time to decide to be there. You're not difficult, you're deliberate, and in a world that treats attention like an infinite resource, that treats presence like it should be available on demand, choosing to protect your rhythm isn't antisocial. It's revolutionary. It's the quiet insistence that you exist on your own terms, in your own time, at your own pace, and that the people worth knowing will meet you there, not in the chaos of last minute, but in the clarity of intentional, not in the rush, but in the arrival, not in the fragment, but in the whole. It's not about closing off, it's about choosing when to open. You can say, "I love spending time with people. I just need to know in advance so I can show up as myself." That's not a character flaw. That's self-awareness. That's the difference between connection and collision, between presence and proximity. Because being in the same room as someone isn't the same as being with them. And you know the difference. The language matters. When you say, "I can't do last minute," the world hears rejection. But what you're really saying is, "I need time to transition. I need time to prepare my energy. I need time to ensure that when I say yes, I mean it completely." That's not detachment. That's devotion to authenticity, to depth, to relationships that don't settle for whatever version of you can be assembled in an hour. You're not asking for special treatment. You're asking for what everyone deserves, the space to choose their presence rather than perform it. And here's what you can tell the people who don't understand. My boundaries around time aren't about you. They're about me showing up for you in a way that honors both of us. Because the truth is, when you decline a last-minute invitation, you're not saying no to the person. You're saying no to the condition that love should be provable through availability, that friendship should require constant flexibility, that connection should override your own internal compass. You're saying that you want something deeper than convenient. You want intentional. This is the practical language of self-respect. Not "I'm too anxious" or "I'm just like this." Phrases that apologize for existing, but rather, "I've learned that I connect better when I have time to prepare. I need advance notice to be the friend, partner, person I want to be. Last minute doesn't work for me, but plan does, and I'd really like to plan something with you." These aren't excuses. They're invitations to a different kind of relationship. One where your needs aren't obstacles to navigate around, but information to build with. And the people who stay, the ones who hear this and adapt, those are your people. Not because they're more understanding, but because they want you whole, not just present. There's something that happens in the space between invitation and arrival. It's where you gather yourself, where you move from the interior world, the one you've been living in all day, all week, into the exterior one. That transition isn't automatic for you. It's not a switch you flip. It's a bridge you have to build, carefully, deliberately, with enough time to carry yourself across without leaving pieces behind. And when someone asks you to make that crossing in an hour and 30 minutes right now, they're asking you to run across a bridge that doesn't exist yet. They're asking you to arrive without traveling, and you know instinctively that you'll fall. Last-minute invitations ask you to be a different kind of person, the kind who lives on the surface, who can skim from one thing to the next, without depth, without integration, without the internal coherence that makes you feel like yourself. And maybe you've tried to be that person. Maybe you've watched others do it so easily, pivot from work to social, from solitude to celebration, from one energy to another without breaking stride. And maybe you've wondered what's wrong with you that you can't. But nothing is wrong with you. You're just someone who lives deeper, who can't perform transitions, who has to experience them. The people who thrive on spontaneity aren't better than you. They're just different. Their nervous systems might regulate differently. Their sense of self might be less tied to routine and predictability. Their energy might replenish in chaos rather than drain from it. But that doesn't make your way wrong. It makes it yours. And spending your life trying to override your own operating system, trying to be spontaneous when you're naturally deliberate, trying to be flexible when you're naturally structured, that's not growth. That's self-abandonment. What you're protecting when you say no to last-minute plans is the possibility of saying yes to something real, to connection that doesn't cost you your coherence, to presence that doesn't require you to fragment, to relationships built on who you actually are, not who you can pretend to be under pressure. And maybe the most radical thing you can do in a world that demands constant availability is to say, I'm not available right now, but I will be. When I've had time to choose you, when I've had time to arrive fully, when I've had time to be someone worth showing up as, that's not withholding. That's offering something rare, your whole self instead of your scattered pieces. Not every hesitation is fear. Sometimes it's where the soul learns its own boundaries. Sometimes it's where you discover that your rhythm isn't wrong. It's just not the one the world taught you to perform. And maybe refusing last-minute invitations isn't escape. Maybe it's the way back to yourself, the way you ensure that when you step into a room you're actually there, not just your body going through motions, but your presence, your attention, your whole undivided self. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being someone who needs advance notice in a world that celebrates spontaneity. You watch the group chats fill with "tonight" and "anyone free," and you feel the familiar tightness, not because you don't want to connect, but because you can't connect like that. You can't summon presence on command. You can't dismantle your evening, your internal world, your carefully constructed piece, and rebuild it around someone else's impulse. And when you say no, when you watch the plans happen without you, there's a voice that whispers, maybe you're the problem. Maybe everyone else has figured out how to be easy, and you're still here, complicated and boundaried and impossible. But what if that voice is wrong? What if the people who can pivot endlessly aren't more evolved, they're just optimized for a different kind of life? What if your need for structure, for notice, for time to prepare, isn't a deficit but a design? One that prioritizes depth over breadth, intention over impulse, quality over quantity? What if every time you've forced yourself to say yes when your whole body was screaming no, you weren't growing? You were just teaching yourself that your needs don't matter. Here's the question the world never asks. What part of you has the world never understood, but that in silence you learn to respect? Maybe it's the part that knows you can't be everything to everyone at every moment. Maybe it's the part that refuses to treat your presence like a commodity that should be available on demand. Maybe it's the part that understands something the culture of constant availability has forgotten, that real connection requires preparation. Not of words or outfits or plans, but of the self, the gathering of your scattered attention, the centering of your energy, the decision to step outside your inner world and meet another. And that decision, that sacred transition, it deserves time. It deserves intention. It deserves to not be treated like it should happen in the space between a text and a doorbell. If this gave you words to understand what you've always felt, subscribe. Here we speak about what the world never named, but you've always known. This isn't about justifying your boundaries to people who will never understand them. It's about finally seeing that those boundaries were never the problem. The problem was a world that taught you to apologize for having them, that told you flexibility was a virtue and structure was a cage. That made you believe your way of connecting was wrong simply because it wasn't fast, wasn't easy, wasn't available on command. You're not broken for needing advance notice. You're not antisocial for declining last-minute invitations. You're not difficult for having a rhythm that doesn't sync with the culture of perpetual availability. You're someone who understands that presence is precious, too precious to give away in fragments, too precious to perform under pressure, too precious to summon without the time to mean it. And the people who matter will learn this about you. They'll text you 3 days ahead. They'll say, "I know you need notice." They'll build space for you to arrive, not just show up, because there's a difference between isolation and intentionality, between walls and windows, between saying no to people and saying no to the conditions that make real connection impossible. You're not avoiding life. You're protecting the quality of your participation in it. You're ensuring that when you say yes, it means something, that when you arrive, you're actually there. That when you connect, it's not just two bodies in proximity, but two presences meeting. Whole, centered, chosen. That's not asking too much. That's asking for what connection actually is. And maybe, in the end, the people who don't accept last-minute invitations aren't the rigid ones. Maybe they're the ones who understand that flexibility without boundaries isn't freedom, it's fragmentation. That spontaneity without preparation isn't aliveness, it's performance. That saying yes to everything means saying yes to nothing fully. You're not missing out by needing time. You're showing up differently, more slowly, more deliberately, more whole. And in a world that mistakes speed for vitality and availability for love, that's not a weakness. That's a revolution you're living quietly, one declined invitation at a time, one protected evening, one honored boundary, one whole arrival. That's not absence. That's where you learn to breathe again.